Today I have a very fun episode for you. I'm going to be speaking with one of my good friends and one of the largest medieval accounts on X, the Medieval Scholar. We're going to be talking about King Henry V and the Great Man Theory of History. Just Feudal Things is a conversational podcast about medieval history featuring subject matter experts and enthusiasts. A new episode comes out on the 3rd and 17th each month. You can join my free Substack, which is linked below. And if you're on X and you'd like a variety of short-form content, you can follow me there, which will also be linked in the bio. Today's guest, Medieval Scholar, you can find his link on X down below, and I would highly recommend that you follow him as he puts out a lot of very in-depth, very informative, very historically accurate threads on a variety of medieval subjects. There's a reason so many people follow him. His content is excellent. He has also just launched a Substack and has much more longer form content coming. You can get the jump on that at the link below in the description as well. Also, unlike many episodes in the past, this episode is going to be audio only, so apologies, there is not any video accompaniment, but I thought it was a fantastic conversation and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So a little background for the audience. There are sort of several main views of history, and these are sort of like the frame with which you would view history through. And so I wanted to get your opinion before we start on sort of the general theory of history, how you would view this, and then we'll talk about Henry V, and then we'll sort of bring it around at the end. So the medieval view of history was essentially that God is in control, or that God guides history. God directs everything that happens in history. And our friend Aristocratic Fury had a great post on this on X, which I'll link in the description if anybody wants to go read that, a description of the medieval view of history. Also, more recently, there have been a few main views of history. One is the Great Man Theory of history, and the other is, I'm not exactly sure how you would describe it, Marxist historiography or the theory of history from below. And I'll describe those real quick, and then I'll let you tell me what, for the audience, and then I'll let you tell me what you think about them. The Great Man Theory of history says that that history is largely directed by these rare great men who show up and have sort of an outsized influence on the way that history goes in any particular direction. So like in present times, a lot of people use this to describe, obviously, a Donald Trump or an Elon Musk, because these are two guys who have sort of an outsized influence on historical events without any sort of value judgment on whatever they're doing. They're just guys that have an extreme outsized influence. And so you could look back into maybe kings or nobles or generals in history and say that these guys have an outsized influence, and they would be the great men of history. The Marxist historiography, or the theory of history from below, suggests that a couple things: that either history is guided by these mass movements, which are sort of bubble up in the public consciousness, and that as people become more aware of something, then things would change in a particular direction because the mass of people wants a different thing. And you could maybe think of, like, I suppose the Enlightenment is one thing that they would say is in that direction, because like everybody just sort of becomes a humanist and then things go in a more humanist direction. Or that history follows some sort of direction relative to social classes, that everything, let's say the poor classes may influence history in a particular way as a way of like revolution against the richer classes, or vice versa. The richer classes may oppress the poor classes, and that the tension between those two drives history. So between sort of these three main views of history, the sort of classic medieval Christian view of history, the Great Man Theory of history, or the Marxist historiography, history from below, how do you generally view history? What's sort of your thought on the tension between those three theories?
In one way or another, I think all three of them sort of blend together into its own type of approach. And to start with the idea of God being in control. I certainly agree with it as myself being a Roman Catholic. I certainly agree with the idea that God either guides or perhaps determines people's destinies or their purposes or what they're meant to achieve and what they're here for on this world. And you can kind of see that with very important figures in history that we learn about, and it sort of flows like a river into the idea of the great man theory and things like that, with people like Henry V in this instance, or you look at someone like Napoleon or Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. These are people who absolutely are like, when you think of history and you think of certain eras of human history, there's usually a defining figure that will immediately come to the mind of the person who is thinking of it when they think of someone like, so if someone thinks of Rome, they will think of someone like Caesar, they will think of someone like Augustus, they will think of someone like Aurelian. Or if you're thinking of, I mean, Napoleon has his own era and type of warfare with his namesake. I think Napoleon is a perfect person to use as a argument for the whole idea of great man theory. But in this case, we're talking about Henry. But there are people who survive unbelievable circumstances that go on to achieve such great things. And it's hard to argue against the idea that God certainly played a part in guiding them to that. There's a saying, I forget exactly what it is, and I think you'll know it. God provides the wind, but man has to sail the ship, or something like that. God will put these people in the right place to achieve what they are capable of, but they themselves have to be the ones to do it. As for the idea, I think we had spoken about it once before, of the influence of below, or whatever it was called, where it was sort of like the people that aren't, I guess, essentially remembered today, the people who aren't part of like the noble class, the people who aren't the aristocracy, the people who like so in the medieval sense, they're the peasants, they're the serfs, they're the ordinary people who maybe even in the army, they're like the conscripts, the people who aren't noble class warriors, knights who had, you know, gone through all this training for decades. My thought is these people are no less important than, the average lord or noble soldier, or no less important than a prince or a king, because these people have their own purpose in society that they fulfilled. They're tilling the fields, they're harvesting the crops, they are building the churches, they're building the castles, they're building the villages, things like that. These people have their own part in society that they play. It's like the saying where it takes a village. It's like everyone's doing their part, everyone's working together to form one big cohesive sort of society. And the success of the society, in this case, like, the Kingdom of England or the Kingdom of France, it's not just a direct result of, the noble. This is all because of the noble class. The ordinary citizens also played a profound role over the course of history to elevate these duchies and kingdoms and everything to be what they are. Like when you go on X and you see people posting about like these big beautiful cathedrals. These are things that were built by the generally ordinary person. We have these today to visit and look at because of them. I generally agree with all three of them together, and I think they all flow into one big sort of set of ideas.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there is certainly something to be said for all of them. Somebody posted the other day, and I don't know if this is actually a real quote from Augustine that's the similar to the one that you're referring to about pray as if God is in control of everything, but then act as if you're in control of everything, or some variation on that. And I think that there's some truth to that. And I think that you're right that it's not that people in lower classes or the people who are not mentioned in history have any less humanity to them. They just are maybe less noted in the histories, but they still have various influences and various purposes that they're fulfilling. And not just necessarily in a peasant uprising, which also gets mentioned, but in the perpetuation of their own societies. And so I do think that I do agree with you that there is some mix of the three, and that it's probably, I think probably where people go wrong is their adherence to one theory at the expense of all the others, because they are kind of just theories and not sort of calibrating their understanding where it may be appropriate. One other thing that I'll say is when I run into people talking about this online, and there's any mention of sort of the medieval mindset as it relates to God's will being manifest in whatever happens historically. The assumption is that God rewards the most righteous person, or the good person always wins, or whatever is the case, but that's obviously not true biblically necessarily. And sometimes people face consequences because of things that they did, or a punishment, or some sort of judgment, or this other thing, which this is very obvious in reading primary sources from the Crusades, where they'll describe good things that happened. We had a victory today, God favored us. Or if they suffered some defeat or something bad happened, they'll say, well, God is judging us for this, that, or the other, which reminds me of the quote of Genghis Khan, where he said, God would not have sent me if you had not committed terrible sins. Well, I forget exactly what the quote is. You know which one I'm
Yeah,
talking
he
about?
he sort of like talked about himself like he was some like divine punishment like sent to Earth to,
Yeah.
or like how everyone viewed the bubonic plague. They viewed it as some sort of like punishment from the heavens for some amount of sin that they had performed.
Right. So I just wanted to make that clear because I think that's an important distinction. A lot of people think about it as if God is only rewarding good people, and that there isn't sort of a mix of judgment and punishment also within that theory.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Henry V, because he is somebody who I feel like he's gotten a reasonable amount of attention. And I believe you mentioned that what got you into Henry V was watching the movie The King. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. It was back in 2019 when I was just a few years out of high school. I had always been into history, but I always had more of like a knack for all things sort of, medieval knights in armor, things like that. And I think Netflix had posted a trailer for The King, and I watched it, and the trailer was fantastic. So it got me excited. And I remember waiting eagerly for a few months until the movie released, and I watched it. And I knew going into it that it was a adaptation of the Shakespeare play, and not so much a direct adaptation of history and the exact way that things played out. But I watched it and I was like, despite whatever inaccuracies may be here, I was like, this guy rules. This guy's awesome.
So is Henry V what essentially made you become a medieval scholar?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Henry's story was very interesting. 2019 obviously is when I saw the movie, but 2023 is when I made the page. I'd always been interested in medieval history. So just I decided to make the page to have an outlet to talk about it, and I would never have guessed to be as big as I am now, only like a year and 3 quarters later.
So maybe for people who are unfamiliar, we'll just sort of run through a little bit of Henry V's history very briefly so they can sort of get an overview of what his life was like. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about, just very briefly, his early life up until the Battle of Shrewsbury, and then we'll talk about that.
Henry was born in the late 14th century, 1386, on September the 16th at Monmouth Castle in Wales. His father was Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke. His mother was Mary de Bohun, and his father's cousin was King Richard II, and his paternal grandfather was John of Gaunt, who is one of the most important figures in English history at the time. In 1398, Henry Bolingbroke was exiled, and so Richard II took, at the time, Henry V into his own care, and he treated him well. He took him to Ireland. They visited Trim Castle in County Meath, which was an ancient meeting place for the Parliament in Ireland. And 1 year later, John of Gaunt died, and in that same year, Richard II was usurped by Henry's father, who then became King Henry IV. But when Henry IV became king, he made his son Henry the Prince of Wales. He also made him Duke of Lancaster in November 10th, 1399. He also bestowed upon his son the titles of Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester, and Duke of Aquitaine. Henry he was very scholarly when he was young. He spent time at Queen's College in Oxford. He had a great love for literature and music, and he also studied he learned to read and write at this school as well. Later in his life, he would go on to grant pensions to composers due to his love of music so that they could go on to create more of this stuff, because these are things that he greatly enjoyed more than just the regular things that kings loved to do. From 1400 to 1404, Henry was serving as High Sheriff of Cornwall, where he led a part of the English forces up there against the rebel Welsh of Owain, and which was also aided by the Percy family. Leading up to the Battle of Shrewsbury, the Percy family are a very powerful, influential house in England, and they serve in these wars and battles against the Scots and the Welsh and things like that. They had helped Henry IV take the throne from Richard II. They aided the king against the Welsh and Owain Glyndwr. For their services, they were promised lands when it was all said and done. And when it was over, the king did not give the Percys the lands that they were promised, and instead it was given to a rival of theirs near Cumberland in England. And they were also promised a good amount of money. And so the Percys, most notably Henry Percy, or also famously known as Harry Hotspur, is not happy. They're furious for this. So Henry Percy goes throughout the countryside and basically musters up and uses his notability, his name, to raise his own army to try and rebel against Henry IV and punish them for this sort of betrayal. And then this all obviously comes to a head at Shrewsbury.
And so Shrewsbury, in my opinion, it's a pivotal part in Henry's story and in his life, and certainly for what we're going to talk about later in the conversation. One of the things that I haven't seen the full movie. It's tough for me to get 2 hours to sit down and see a whole thing. But I've seen some clips from The King. And I think one thing from my knowledge now of how these guys grew up versus how they're portrayed in these films is that you mentioned Henry is very scholarly. He has a lot of taste in art or music. But one of the things also that is maybe less mentioned, but you did mention it a little bit, that he's the Sheriff of Cornwall for 4 years, is that he had a lot of military training, and he was a pretty tough guy. I mean, he developed into quite a formidable warrior, and during this period, he would have had a lot of military training, a lot of training in the use of various weapons, horsemanship, And he would have been, certainly, I think, at the time of Shrewsbury, when he's only 16, he still was a reasonably formidable warrior, even then, for being only 16 years old. So he would have had a lot of military training, right?
Yeah, he would have had the same sort of training. I mean, he being a prince, he's obviously much higher than the average noble. He would have had the same training that someone who wishes to be a knight would get, but he would get it from, the best that can be offered because he is the Prince of Wales. He's the son of the king. And and obviously, yeah, like you said, by the time Shrewsbury happens, he's 16. But by now, he has military experience. He has battle experience. He is familiar with weapons and armor and tactics and things like that. And
That's something that strikes me as a difference between the clips that I've seen of the film The King, like the duel between him and Harry Hotspur, or as we'll talk about in a little bit in the Battle of Agincourt, is how Henry is portrayed in this film as being somewhat timid or cautious, or it almost seems like he's scared to fight, that he doesn't want to fight. But in reality,
mm,
Henry was a fighter, right?
yeah, so the most notable part of the king in terms of like his personality is when they're talking about like, oh, France is taunting us, and we should go to war with France. And Henry is he's cautious, and he's sort of initially against the idea entirely of even going to war against France. At that point, the Hundred Years' War is in a small period of peace, and Henry is the one that starts that back up. And in the movie, he's displayed as someone who he doesn't really want to do that. He doesn't want to go to war. He doesn't want to risk lives. He doesn't want to fight in battle. Where in reality, Henry was very much eager to go to war against France, and he had no qualms. He had no qualms restarting the Hundred Years' War and basically canceling out the peace that they had between the two kingdoms at the time.
Okay, so tell us about the Battle of Shrewsbury.
Okay, so the Battle of Shrewsbury is when Henry Percy and his rebellious force meets Henry the Fourth and his son Prince Henry on July 21st, 1403, at Shrewsbury in Shropshire, England. They both have a culminated force of about 14,000 soldiers. They both of their forces are bolstered by the English longbowmen, which will be very famous later in this story. Most people who know about Henry will know why the English longbowmen are obviously so famous. During the Hundred Years' War, at this point, the English longbowmen have displayed themselves to be basically a killing machine, the bane of really any soldier's existence because of the power and distance that these arrows could travel and deliver. So 2 hours before dusk, Henry the Fourth raises his sword and orders a barrage of arrows, and for the essentially marking the beginning of the battle. The Cheshire archers of Henry Percy, according to chronicles, were said to be superior to that of the royal army, and an English chronicler named Thomas Walsingham said that the king's men fell like leaves in autumn, and every one arrow struck a mortal man. So you can infer just from these quotes that the battle, pretty much from the get go, is chaos, just from the falling of the just a storm of arrows on both sides. So the battle ensues, and at some point during the battle, Henry, Prince of Wales, raises his visor to either get a better look around the battlefield or to get better airflow, because obviously when adrenaline is pumping and you are breathing faster, being stuck inside a helmet is probably not the place you really want to be. So maybe for a moment he needed to get a better gasp of air, and unluckily for him, he gets an arrow right in his face, to the next to his nose, under his eye, and it burrows itself 6 inches deep into his skull. And incredibly enough, the 16-year-old Prince Henry continues to fight like this for about 2 hours with an arrow sticking out of his face. And meanwhile, Henry Harry Hotspur, takes an arrow to his face during the battle and is killed in action. Hotspur's death pretty much marks the end of the battle. The rebellious forces are routed and they retreat or surrender. All surviving leaders of the rebellion during the battle are captured. Thomas Percy, who is Henry Percy's uncle, is executed for his rebellion, and both sides sustain heavy losses and casualties. But it is a victory for Henry IV and the royal forces. But now the matter at hand is that the prince has an arrow in his face, and they need to do something about it.
Yeah, so tell us about that.
So Henry, so he takes an arrow in his face, and they call on.
He fought for 2 hours with the arrow in his face, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, even that itself is an insane thing to think about when you have an arrow burrowed 6 inches deep into your skull. That is not pleasant, but it's that do your duty type of mentality, or this sort of like warrior ferocity that just keeps him kind of going. So he has the arrow in his face, 6 inches deep in his skull. They call the physician general or royal surgeon John Bradmore to help the prince. Now, this is a wound that would kill pretty much anybody, should kill pretty much anybody at the time. There's really no reason that Prince Henry should survive this wound. But John Bradmore, he actually he creates an entirely new tool for this procedure. It's a 2-part tool that has a threaded rod that is meant to burrow itself into the socket of the arrow and locks it in place to get a firm grip, which would allow them to safely extract the arrow from his head. They treated it with honey-based ointments, things like that. And obviously this is 1403. There is not anesthesia. You're awake for this. You can imagine that it must have been excruciatingly painful. And
you think you're having a bad week. You didn't have to get shot in the face with an arrow, fight for another 2 hours, and then lay somewhere for a week with honey being poured into your face while somebody invents a tool to pull this arrow 6 inches out of your face. I mean, I can't even imagine trying to sleep during that whole time. I think it's safe to say that's probably the worst week of his life.
Yeah. So they removed the arrow. The wound is cleansed and treated with like honey-based ointments and alcohol, or wine to cleanse it. And Henry ends up surviving. The arrow actually narrowly misses his brain, just like his brain stem. And so he gets phenomenally lucky. He recovers from this wound with a scar. That's about it.
Yeah, it's really a phenomenal story to imagine that he survives all of this. Because even now, as you're talking about it, I'm thinking, how did he lay there with an open wound for a week? They didn't have blood transfusions at the time or anything like that. I mean, it's just wild to consider what a feat of medieval medicine this would have been.
And to invent a whole new tool for this procedure, because it didn't exist before this, is fascinating. And the only surviving portrait that we have of Henry V is, that one of him facing sideways. He's looking to our left, and he intentionally has these sort of portraits made because he doesn't want the scar to be shown to the people who are going to look at these portraits, who are going to look at them. So for the time, the scar must be very obviously gruesome, or at least to him it is, that he doesn't want other people to see it.
Okay, so after he recovers from Shrewsbury, then maybe you can give us a quick history recap of what happens between then and him reopening the next phase of the Hundred Years' War.
Okay, so in 1413, so this is 10 years later, on March 20th, his father, Henry IV, dies. And so Henry, Prince of Wales, now becomes King Henry V of England. He's crowned on April 9th, 1413, at Westminster Abbey. During his coronation, it's actually marked by a snowstorm, with which people debated whether or not that this was a good or a bad omen of things to come with this new king. And so, being king, Henry V is described, quote, very tall, about 6 foot 3 inches, which is 192 centimeters. He's slim with dark hair cropped in a ring above the ears, and he's clean shaven. Depending on his mood, it was stated that his eyes would, quote, flash from the mildness of a dove to the brilliance of a lion's. So Henry is someone who could really, like, as the people say, he can really lock in. Henry can lock in on a dime, and he's very determined and persistent individual. Upon taking the throne in 1414, there is an event called the Oldcastle Revolt, where Henry acts very swiftly and ruthlessly to crush it, to quell the rebellion, and he eventually executes his old friend Sir John Oldcastle in 1417 by burning him. The most notable sort of revolt or plot that's involved with Henry once he becomes king is the Southampton plot. And this is a conspiracy that is intended to remove Henry from power. Their aim is to depose him, assassinate him, likely, and replace him with Edmund Mortimer, who's the 5th Earl of March, and install him as the King of England. Henry ends up discovering that Richard, the Earl of Cambridge, and Henry Scrope are the masterminds behind this plot, and so they are executed in Southampton by having their heads cut off.
Sorry, let me ask you a question about that real quick. This plot against King Henry, is it because anybody had a particular beef with him, or was it because they just preferred the Mortimer guy? What was the deal with what was sort of the main motivation of that?
So it was actually revealed to Henry relatively soon to when he was preparing to sail on campaign to France. And so Edmund Mortimer, who, like I said, was the 5th Earl of March, he is the great grandson of Lionel of Antwerp, who's the second surviving son of King Edward III. And as a result, he's making his claim that he is the rightful heir to the throne of England. And so obviously Henry is the son of Henry IV. Henry IV obviously is known as usurping the throne from Richard II. And so there's definitely people who want Edmund Mortimer to be king. And in this case, Richard, Earl of Cambridge, and Henry Scrope, as well as there were other conspirators, because there were three ringleaders. Three ringleaders were the Earl of Cambridge. There was Edmund of Langley, who was Mortimer's first cousin, Henry Scrope, and then Sir Thomas Grey. And the Henry is informed of the plot on, I think, the end of July. Richard, Scrope, and Grey get arrested for it. They are put on trial in Southampton, and Grey gets beheaded on the 2nd of August, and then it all goes on from there. So it's basically just like it's a result of like a succession battle, a succession crisis. They believe that Edmund Mortimer is the one that truly deserves to be on the throne of England. Henry finds out about it. Henry punishes them for it.
So it wasn't anything specific necessarily that Henry did, more the sort of usurpation by his father
It's
combined with
yeah,
these
it's
other
like
guys'
the
claims.
sins of the father case.
Okay.
It's like Henry's the son of the usurper. He doesn't deserve to be on the throne. Edmund Mortimer is the rightful king. Blah blah blah.
So go ahead and walk us real quick then through the beginning of the reopening of the Hundred Years' War.
Henry does the same thing that Edward III does. He makes the claim to the throne of France through dynastic claim, same as his ancestor Edward III does. Using this so he says that he's the rightful heir to the throne of France. He should be rightfully king. So he uses this to justify declaring war. And obviously, the French hear this and they go, "No, you're not. Go away." And so Henry declares war in 1415, and then from there he sails from Southampton to France.
And so his first objective is the siege of Harfleur, right?
Yeah, so they want to set up essentially a base of operations in France. They want to set up a place where they can freely transport more soldiers, supplies and things like that to the royal army that is now on campaign on the French mainland. Excuse me. And so they lay siege to Harfleur. On the 12th of August in 1415, Henry sails from England in Southampton to France, and he lays siege to Harfleur. And this is marking the beginning of his campaign against the French. He attacks Harfleur with about 2,300 men at arms, with 9,000 archers, and the French garrison of Harfleur was defended by a mere 100 men. The French end up soon receiving reinforcements, and from 2 knights who bring 300 men at arms with them to defend the garrison of Harfleur. But Henry brings siege weapons with him. He brings 12 great guns, and these are used to damage the walls of Harfleur greatly. Henry had planned to eventually full-on assault Harfleur, but before he could do that, the town's commanders asked for parley, and Henry and the leaders of Harfleur end up agreeing to terms. So Harfleur surrenders to Henry, and the townspeople who swore allegiance to him were allowed to stay at Harfleur because they are now his subjects, essentially. The knights were released on parole for ransom, and the others were told, who didn't swear allegiance to him, were told to leave. So they do suffer disease, and as it usually goes with sieges, the English army suffered, I think, about 2,000 to 5,000 deaths, and from illness, I think about 2,200 of those were illness. So mainly like dysentery. Obviously, during siege in these types of camps, dysentery runs rampant, spreads like wildfire, and in time period like 1415, dysentery is pretty much a death sentence. And so after this, they capture Harfleur. Harfleur is annexed by England, and they begin to march onwards towards Calais.
And so this is where we get the setup for the Battle of Agincourt, right?
Yeah, that's right. So for leading up to Agincourt, so Henry and his army wants to march to Calais. This is like their next base of operations, their next part of the sort of supply chain that they want to have. Like, supplies and soldiers come from England, they land on the shores of France, they have a place to be at Harfleur, and then the next one would be Calais. So the French, who's led by Charles d'Albret, who's the constable of France, is trying to cut Henry off. They don't want him to reach Calais. They don't want him to get a further foothold than he already does in their country. And so they block him at the River Somme. And Henry begins to then move south with his soldiers and cross the Somme at Péronne, and then Bethencourt, and then Voyenne. Henry attempts to then move through the French countryside to reach Calais that way, but the French intercept him, and they intercept him at near the village of Agincourt on October the 25th.
And so I think most people are pretty familiar with the Battle of Agincourt, but if you want to give us just a very brief summary for anybody who's not familiar.
Okay, so for context, for people who don't know about the Battle of Agincourt, or perhaps only know it by name, this is probably England's greatest military victory ever. So, for context, the English, as I previously mentioned, had been ravaged by dysentery during the siege of Harfleur. And now that they've been intercepted at Agincourt, they are low on food and supplies. Many of them are still sick with dysentery. They're hungry. They're dying. And they've marched about 260 miles over 2.5 weeks. They're exhausted. They're tired. The French outnumber them massively. They are well supplied. They have the home field advantage. They are well fed. They're well armed, and they're well rested. The numbers are about 6,000 to 8,000 men for the English, and for the French, they have about 14,000 to 15,000 men, or if you want to include armed servants, that's about 25,000 capable fighting men. So about 10,000 men at arms, which when you look at these old battles, when you look at the term men at arms, they're referring to knights. So Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, and his massive army outnumbered the English about 2-1. The night before the Battle of Agincourt, it rains heavily. Where they fight the battle is on farmland near the village. And so it had been recently plowed for planting for the harvest. So because of this freshly plowed field and the heavy rains, the battlefield is a muddy quagmire bog of drenched soil. So Henry's battle plan is to use this to their advantage to conquer these insurmountable odds. This is in every shape or form, this is a battle that they should lose. They should just be entirely wiped out. There should be no chance that the French lose this battle. So the English stand wearing plate and mail armor shoulder to shoulder, about 4 men deep, and on the flanks were the English and Welsh archers who carved wooden stakes to guard themselves. Henry actually had learned this from the Battle of Nicopolis and what the Ottomans had utilized to defeat Sigismund and his Crusader army. So when the French mounted knights charge and the rain of arrows comes down from the archers, there's nothing that they can really do about it, because they can't charge the archers, because they'll just impale themselves on the wooden stakes. So the horses are wounded or killed. Knights are killed. They're thrown from their horses. They land. People are trampled in the mud, and the French monk of Saint Denis describes it as a terrifying, or quote, a terrifying hail of arrow shot. That obviously a brutal melee ensues. Henry is in the vanguard of his army. For those who are unaware, the vanguard is the main fighting force. It's the front. It's the heaviest part of the army. Henry's at the front of it. He's fighting with his men in hand to hand, according to English contemporary accounts. He's fighting on the front lines with his soldiers. And it's said that many French soldiers died by suffocating in their own armor or drowning in the muddy field. It's a total massacre. England wins in a unbelievable underdog victory. Charles d'Albret, the French leader of the entire army here, is killed in battle, along with John, the Duke of Alençon, who actually is said to have been who actually tried to surrender to Henry and his forces, but was ruthlessly cut down. Anyways, about 600 English soldiers die in battle, and about 6,000 French soldiers die. And about 40% of the French nobility is killed in this battle.
Yeah, it strikes me from reading about various battles of the time that Agincourt is one of the most brutal battles, I mean, maybe ever, with these guys just drowning in their own armor and stuff.
Yeah, it's the reading the accounts are terrifying. When obviously brutal hand-to-hand combat like this, it's already frightening enough, but to imagine people are grappling with each other in these brutal melees and you know, shoving someone's face like into the mud, and the mud is going into their visor, and you just drown them in this thick bog of mud. Yeah, it's brutal.
And one of the things that I did want to bring up is that I think that relative to how it's portrayed in media, like movies, like you could think about Braveheart, is that these archers are not super effective is how they're portrayed. They all sort of stand there and the guy goes, "Okay, ready, everybody go." And then they
Yeah.
shoot an arrow, and then, everybody stands around and waits for a minute, and then he goes, "Okay, fire." And they shoot again. But in reality, a single
These
longbowman,
guys were skilled.
well, but
These guys
also,
these guys could fire rapid hails of arrows.
right. I think I read recently somewhere that a longbowman could fire somewhere around eight arrows a minute, which, if you multiply that by 5,000 archers, that's 40,000 arrows in a minute.
Yeah, 5/6 of the English army were archers. So imagine 8 arrows a minute of 5/6 of the English army just unloading hundreds, if not thousands, of arrows down on you.
Right. And that's the thing that is kind of crazy to start to think about, is with this army of 5,000 archers, how over the course of several minutes they could fire 100,000 arrows into the oncoming French who were bogged down in the mud. So these dudes are getting just slowed down, and then the
Yeah,
English are
they're
just
they're
bombarding
slipping and
them.
sliding in the mud in their plate armor. They're already slower than, let's say, like an archer in lighter armor. They're slow. They're slightly slowed down, just from the armor itself, but they're also slowed down from the arrows coming down and killing everyone around them, and they're slowed down in the mud, and they're trying to get over their dead horses and their dead comrades, and it's a total catastrophe.
All right, so total victory for Henry, essentially. Maybe walk us through real quick how this all wraps up, and then what happens with the treaty and so forth that he establishes with France.
Okay. So Agincourt obviously is a massive crushing defeat for France. They lose their constable, they lose 40% of their nobility. It's a catastrophe for the kingdom. After Agincourt, Henry goes on to later conquer Rouen, which is the capital of Normandy, and as a result, it leads to Henry capturing and conquering, taking control of Normandy, and as a result, much of northern France as a whole. This is from July of 1418 until January of 1419, and in 1420, Henry meets with the King of France, Charles VI, and they sign the Treaty of Troyes, which acknowledges Henry as the regent and the heir to the French throne. This delegitimizes Louis the Dauphin, the son of Charles VI, and now Henry is the heir to the throne of France. Henry also marries Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois, to fully solidify this agreement and alliance. And they end up having a kid who is famously Henry VI. And from there, it should be smooth sailing for Henry. It's He's pretty much succeeded in what people like Edward III and others had attempted to do, and all he has to do is now wait for Charles VI to pass away, and that from there he'll take control of France. Alas, this is not how it happens in our timeline. Henry V dies on August 31st in 1422 to the east of Paris. He died of dysentery that he likely contracted during the siege of Meaux at the age of 35, and he reigned as the King of England for 9 years. And it's unfortunate because Charles VI passes away just a few months later. It's very unfortunate timing for Henry. He passes away just a few months before he would have seen the fruits of his hard work actually come to pass.
It can seem like it may have been smooth sailing for Henry if he would have just lived a few months longer, but
Hmm.
there probably would have been some pushback from the French nobility, possibly some rebellions. It wasn't necessarily just cut and dry that then he would have been the king, right?
Yeah, that's right. So obviously, the Kingdom of France is much larger than the Kingdom of England. France is it's larger, it's more powerful, and but though they did lose 40% of their nobility at the Battle of Agincourt, but I can imagine that the remaining nobility of France, as well as the common people, would not take too kindly, perhaps, to the King of England, who had conquered much of the north of their country, to now taking the throne, and in the process delegitimizing the son of Charles VI, Louis the Dauphin. So there is that possibility that Henry could have experienced rebellions and uprisings within the Kingdom of France if he had taken the throne. But given his past, what he had experienced with things such as Southampton or Oldcastle, or even when he was a teenager as a prince against the Percys and the Welsh, Henry is this figure who rebellions and uprisings are not really foreign to him. This is something that he has experienced before and he has confronted firsthand, both in battle and politically. And I would believe that if anyone would have been capable of quelling such a tough political, social, strife-filled environment, it would have been Henry V. But alas, it's all something that's up to speculation. It's not anything that we'll ever know.
That makes for a really fascinating what if, because what if he had become king? Would the kingdom have rebelled? Would he have been able to do it? But on the other hand, rebellions and plots and things like that seem a little bit like his specialty. So if anybody could have done it, I would imagine it would have been him.
Yeah, precisely. I think he dies at 35, so he would have taken the throne at 35. He had been dealing with the Welsh and the Percys and people like that since his teenage years. The Battle of Shrewsbury is in when he's 16. So this is not something that is new to him. He has plenty of experience dealing with it. So by the time that he does take the throne of France, it had have been over uh, over 15 years, going on 20 years since that had happened. And he would have likely had the experience both militarily and politically to be able to deal with these problems.
So bringing this back around, one of the things that really made me start thinking about this was an initial conversation that we had on X where we were talking about the Battle of Shrewsbury, and I had said something like, "How did he survive?" You had made a post about, I think it was a thread about Shrewsbury and his incredible injury, and I had said something like, "How did he survive that injury?" And your response was just mandate of heaven. And so it's really interesting because, let's sort of bring this back around to the theories of history. He obviously has that catastrophic injury and survives. He goes through this incredible military career, conquers the northern part of France, makes this treaty, marries the king's daughter, has everything set up for him, but then he dies of dysentery, which is a rather inglorious and sort of anticlimactic end almost. How do we what do you think is maybe a good way to sort of with through these theories of history to kind of look at Henry's life and legacy?
I think when you look at it, Henry V and his anticlimactic end to his life is no different. These anticlimactic ends to these great people. It's not something that's new. This is something that we have seen before in history with increasingly greater people. Alexander, Napoleon, Caesar, they're great conquerors, politicians. They are people who shape much of their time period and their part of the world to their will. And they die in very anticlimactic or inglorious ways, or perhaps ways that just don't fit a life or career such as them. Alexander dies of, I think it was the flu or some sort of illness. Napoleon dies in exile of, I think, stomach cancer. And Caesar dies of assassination by the senators. But you can also make the argument that all these men were guided by some divine purpose, some sort of divine destiny that leads them to accomplish all the incredible things that they did. Um with Henry at Shrewsbury surviving an arrow shot to the face that lodges itself 6 inches into your skull and allegedly narrowly misses his brainstem. And then you fight for 2 more hours. So not only do you survive the injury, you also survive the battle. And then you win the battle and you get back to where you are to be treated. And the doctor invents a whole new medical tool to remove the arrow from your head. And you survive that as well. And obviously, this is the 1400s. There is no anesthesia. You can't just be put to sleep and wake up and you're all stitched up and you're fine. He had to deal with this and, tough it out. This is like I previously mentioned with Shrewsbury, Henry Percy dies of a similar injury. He also dies of an arrow to his head. And, this is an injury that would kill pretty much anyone else. So you can look at it as some sort of like divine intervention that saves Henry's life because he, in my eyes, is meant for a higher purpose. Henry is not meant to die that day in that field at Shrewsbury. He's meant to go on and achieve all the things that he did achieve in his life. And not to be too existential, but his time when your time is up, your time is up. And for Henry, his time was up when he was 35, and that's just how he ended up going.
So this actually just occurred to me as you're saying this, and I feel like through this conversation, I've had a lot. Henry has seemed a lot more similar to Richard in a lot of ways. Everybody probably knows I'm a big Richard the Lionheart fan, and so one of the things, like in that aristocratic fury post on the medieval Christian view of history, one of the things that he mentions in there is how this concept of historical importance or historical impact is kind of like a newfangled, post enlightenment idea that somebody is maybe a great man or a great king because of their historical impact. Whereas at the time, the medievals would have thought that somebody like Louis the Ninth would have been a great king because he was virtuous, because he exhibited these qualities or characteristics that would have been desirable or admirable of somebody that would have been expected of his position. Do you think we place too much emphasis on historical importance or impact when we look at historical figures like Henry?
It's actually a good question. I think I don't believe that we put too much emphasis on historical impact because that's precisely why we study these things, is their impact on history and how they shape the world around them and how we live in the world that we do today because of all these events that happen the way they do. I think they look at it back then, the medievals, they look at it differently because it's relatively current events for them. Something like Agincourt is over 600 years old. And for them at the time, it's recent. For them, it's a very religious society. They're very in tune with God, and they are used to attributing, very good fortune and great things happening to God and thanking God for that. And like we had mentioned earlier, with things like the Black Death or with like Genghis Khan and the Mongols, they also view these things as like divine punishment for whatever sins that they may have committed. And but I think also it doesn't necessarily dismiss that even back then they would have also, obviously they would have hailed their leaders or great people as equally in high regard as we look at it today, celebrating the king and celebrating the army and their success. Obviously, they give thanks to God for allowing these things to happen, but also, like I mentioned earlier, with the saying of something along the lines of God provides the wind, and it's up to man to steer the ship. God gave the wind in the sails of Henry and his forces to lead them into this area, and Henry was able to steer his ship to succeed in this point of his life and these major accomplishments that he did. So God, I believe, put him in this position or put him in the positions to achieve these things, but it was up to Henry in the end to be able to also make good on those opportunities.
Okay, and so last thing here for anybody that wants to follow your X account or your Substack, those links will be below. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what else you'll be working on and what's coming up and what you have going on?
Yeah, so I have planned for my Substack. I don't have anything published on it just yet, but I'm setting it up. I would like to get into more long form writings because threads are good to get a nice general, slightly in depth look into certain events, depending on how much you write. But threads can only allow up to 25 posts. So eventually, depending on how long each post is, you're going to have to miss some things. And with long form writing, there isn't a limit to that, and you can include as much as you'd like. So for me, I, even before I started this, I loved writing. And so I'm very excited to start writing more long form posts about things like the Teutonic Knights and the Northern Crusades uh, and that relatively sized kingdom that the Teutonic Knights sort of set up within the Baltic states, as well as uh, Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian and his role within the empire and the Italian wars and things like that. Henry V, obviously. Also, Wars of the Roses and other more niche things like religion and culture and the arts. And so I hope that people will be eager to read these writings just as much as I am to write them.